Okay. Yesh Lomar, right? We're in chapter 3, the second Yesh Lomar. So there's a second Chiddush. The Rebbe gives us a second Chiddush. The Masha Katuv Bekama Drushim.
Where are you?
Chapter 3, the second Yesh Lomar.
It's on the next page? Or on the same page?
I don't know. I don't have your copy.
Print.
Yeah. You might have two of the same thing.
This one here.
Yeah, so the next page.
This
Reish
one.
Kaf Gimel. Found it? Yeah.
Right.
מה שכתוב בכמה דרושים מובא לעיל, שבתחיית המתים יהיה גילוי ההמשכה שנמשכת על ידי קיום המצוות, וכי שם מדובר בשכר לישראל שיהיה בעולם הבא עבור עבודתם בתורה ומצוות בעולם הזה. So as we said, that the revelation of the reward of what we get for the performance of mitzvos in this world is discussing the reward. That's the reward for what you did in this world. Okay, so the revelation is the reward itself. V'shleimut hasachar, but the consummate reward. So he says it's like the reward and there's the consummate reward. We'll see what this means. הוא שיעיר להם בגילוי ההמשכה שהמשיכו על ידי קיום המצוות. Is that you become aware of the fact that what you have received is payment or reward for the performance of the mitzvot that you did. So he says it could be two things. A person, like now, we might say that now there's many things, like we discussed yesterday, that we're receiving now as payment, as it were, from spiritual acts in the past. But we don't see the connection. We don't see it. Right? We're not aware of it. So he says to become aware of the connection is the consummate reward.
Can't you make yourself aware of it? Can't you think about it?
You can think about it, but if you don't see it, it's not the same thing. People want to see the cause and effect. They want to be able to understand that yes, what I'm receiving now is the result of what I did in the past. Otherwise, what does it give you? It gives you a sense of dissonance. Because you feel your identity ripped. Because a person doesn't want to live. Again, that's part of what Hume built his whole theory of causality about. That if the mind doesn't see the link between the cause and the effect, it's dissonant. It doesn't work.
Train your mind every time something good happens.
Yeah, but it's not the same thing as actually seeing it.
It's as if you saw it.
It's as if. It's like the guy who says, if you give me payment as if I worked, so I'll also work as if I worked. Yeah? If you're not going to pay me for real, why would I work for real? There has to be, right, the famous story that illustrates this. That the Paritz, that the nobleman invites one of the workers from the field into his office. And he says, look, I'm going to pay you exactly the same, but I want you to do as if you're reaping the wheat here in my office. He looks around and says, there's no wheat here. He says, I know. I just want you to do the motions as if you're reaping it. So like grab a bunch and use your, the sickle, and as if you're cutting it. I'll pay you exactly the same. Just do this all day here in the office. It's nice here, you're not in the sun. Maybe he has air conditioning already, who knows? And I'll pay you exactly the same. So the guy's really, happy at the beginning. Doesn't have to be outside with the insects and with the heat and this and that. So he starts doing it. After an hour, he says to the nobleman, I'm sorry, I quit. I can't do it. He says, why? It's much better tnaim, much better conditions than you had when you were out in the field. He says, yeah, but it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything. We have to, the mind has to feel that what it did led to what there is. If you don't feel that, then you lose interest. That's really the deeper problem behind what we call lechem boshet, that a person receives something for nothing. It causes dissonance in the soul. You can't continue this way for too long. If it's bad when you're doing as if you're working and you're not working, okay, just as if you're cutting the weed, but you're not cutting the weed. It's even worse when you're not doing anything. You're just sitting on the sofa, and the money pours in. Right? It's very interesting that all these get-rich-quick schemes, they promise you you're just going to have. It's all going to be passive income. You're going to sleep, and in your sleep, money is going to come in. What they don't tell you is, even if there was such a thing, you'd go nuts after a month. People think, yeah, no problem. I can take. Just give me the money. I don't care. If they really have no problem, they're dead already. They're not alive anyway. So whatever they have or don't have doesn't matter. But a person who's alive, who has feeling, you can't live that way. A person has to feel that I acted, and here's the result, because that's how the brain is wired. And so you can train yourself to say the opposite. I worked very hard, and I don't see the connection to what I got, but it must be because I worked very hard. No, there you can get away with it because you worked. Yeah. But if you didn't work, the brain can't handle it. It can't stand it. Anyway, so he says the consummate reward is that you get to see the connection. You get to see the causality between what you did spiritually in the past and the reward you're receiving in the world of resurrection. ולכן מבואר בדרושים אלו ששכר הנשמות בגן עדן הוא שמשיגים האלוקות דהתורה שלמדו בעולם הזה. התורה היא חוכמתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, אור הממלא, והשכר דתחיית המתים הוא שאז יראו עינינו גילוי אלוקותו הבלתי בעל גבול שנמשך על ידי קיום המצוות. It says, in the same way that in the Garden of Eden, what you receive is you get to see how the Torah that you learned actually impacted you. It's very interesting. Think about this. Chazal say, the sages say, that we don't learn Torah to receive a reward. We learn Torah lishma, for its own sake. But on the other hand, they say many, many rewards that a person who learns Torah receives. They enumerate many of them. You could say maybe there's at least 15 or 16 different things mentioned in respect to what you receive for learning Torah. So which is it? So you should be learning in Avos. V'zochel dvarim arbe. It says all the things that you merit. Out of those 48 things, about 15 or 16 are like rewards. They're not just necessary conditions. There's many things that you merit. It's clear, it's very clear that you get many things for learning Torah. So which is it? Are you learning lishma for its own sake, or are you learning for the reward? Right. So really you should be learning lishma for its own sake.
You are, but those other things just happen to come by the
They happen to happen, right? They happen to come. In the Garden of Eden, you get to see what came. And it's very interesting that there, what you get to see is how it impacted you. What you see is how it affected you internally, because that's the purpose of Torah. Torah is not for bringing down parnasa. It's not for that. You don't learn Torah to bring parnasa down. You do other things to bring parnasa. But Torah is for changing who you are. It's supposed to affect who you are. But a person usually in this world, he doesn't see it. He can't see it. So, the Garden of Eden is like where you receive the Eden, right? It's the. We'll say this in a moment, I think, that Adam was in the Garden of Eden. So they ask, if he was in the Garden of Eden, so he must have learned everything. So he must have received all the benefits of what he did. So he says, no, two things. Garden is one thing, and Eden is another thing. What do we mean to say?
Alive long enough to do anything.
No, whatever length of time he had.
No, the second he was born, he was in the garden.
Said no, but he was doing something. So he received the reward. He felt it, like in the Garden of Eden. Why do we call it the Garden of Eden? Because there's an understanding, like in the afterlife, that you understand what happened to you while you were learning. So Adam had this inner understanding. That's what would follow. So the sages say, no, the garden is one thing and Eden is something else. What's the garden? The garden is where he was, but he wasn't in Eden. It's a very deep thing. He didn't receive Eden. What does Eden mean? Eden. What does that mean? Yeah, literally. When you call somebody Adin, he's delicate, he's refined, he's gentle. Refined is the word. Me'udan is refined. When you want to say somebody's refined, say he's me'udan. The Eden is how the Torah affected and refined your neshama. How it affected you. Did it affect the animal soul? Not always so much. But it also affected the animal soul. It certainly affected your intellectual soul. It refined your intellectual soul. But you're not aware of it. Why? Because even Adam was only in the garden and not in Eden. So he was aware of the fruits that he received from learning Torah, but he wasn't aware about how it impacted him. In the Garden of Eden, he says, you get to see how the learning of the Torah that you did impacted your refinement as a person. That's what you get to see. What is that, by the way? That's Chassidus. Chassidus is exactly that. What's happening in Chassidus? Chassidus reveals how the Torah impacts your psyche, how it impacts your character, how it impacts. That's a whole. In a certain sense, that's how it changes your inner self. In a certain sense, Chassidus is the Torah of the Garden of Eden. It is what's revealed. So that's why people said that Chassidus is already a taste from the Torah of Mashiach. But here the argument he says is, in the same way that in the Garden of Eden, in the afterlife, the soul merits to see the connection between what it learned and how it affected it, the refinement, the reward that it received for what it learned. In the same way, in the world to come, you'll merit to see the connection between the world you created and what you created it from, which was your observance of mitzvos. So both of them are a state of understanding the connection, understanding the causality. It's a very interesting thing. And that's why both of them are called Olam Haba. Right? We said that's what we began with. Both of them are called the world to come. Why? Because it says everywhere that Olam Haba is in Bina. Anytime you mention Olam Haba, you're talking about Bina, understanding, the sphere of understanding. What is the sphere of understanding about? What is it specifically about? It's about understanding the connections. Mevin davar mitoch davar. Ledamot milta lemilta. You see the connection between two things. You see that they're linked. So, from the Torah, you get to see the causality in the Garden of Eden. From the mitzvahs that you do, you get to see the causality in the world to come, meaning the world of resurrection. But both of them are about the same thing. What's the difference also? That in the Gan Eden, you see the infinite causality. The causality that we call the causality of the infinite aspect of God. Why? Because the Torah represents the infinite aspect of God.
You don't see the infinite aspect of God.
What?
No one can see.
Sorry, I said it backwards. In Gan Eden, you see the limited aspect. And in the world to come, in the world of resurrection, you see the infinite aspect. Why? Because the soul is dealing with the limited aspect of God. But the body, because it's dealing with God's will, is manifesting the infinite aspect of God. אמנם, כל זהו השכר לישראל עבור עבודתם בתורה ומצוות. ועיקר החידוש והעילוי שיהיה בעולם הבא הוא הגילוי דמעלת ישראל עצמם, נצר 200 מעשה ידי לתפאר. So we added here another thing, that both the Garden of Eden and the world of resurrection are about seeing causality, and that is the consummate reward. But don't forget that we also now added at the beginning of this chapter that the real purpose, the real height, the real apex of the world of resurrection is not that you get a reward, but that the intrinsic value of being a Jewish soul is revealed. So they're both all about revelations.
But the intrinsic soul is not dependent on you.
Intrinsic value, right. It's not dependent on anything that you did or didn't do. Okay? Dalet. So chapter 4. וביאור העניין, ג' מדרגות האלו, גן עדן ושתי הדרגות בתחיית המתים. So now he wants to, again, focus on the Garden of Eden and these two levels of revelation in the world of resurrection. So all three of them are dealing with revelations. By the way, if they're revelations, so what about the two other states? This world and the times of Mashiach. So from that you can understand that the essence of this world, the reality that we're in, and the times of Mashiach is not going to be about revelation. It's going to be about work.
What do you mean?
When Moses came to Egypt, the first thing that happened after he approached Pharaoh was that they had to work harder. And he got really upset with Hashem. And he said, I came to save them from the work, from the labor, from the enslavement. And the only thing I've been able to do since I've come here is make it worse. So Hashem gets angry at him and says, well, you don't understand? You really don't understand? And Moshe, I don't think he gets an answer. He just says, I should have trusted Hashem. I don't know what the answer is, but I should have trusted him. But it seems that the answer is in the words themselves. What was the purpose of being in Egypt?
To refine
To work.
the film.
To work. That work eventually transformed into what they received with the Torah, that they now had the ability to work in learning the Torah.
Then why didn't Shevet Levi have to work?
Not everybody works in the same thing. They also worked, but they worked spiritually. In the same way that today, there's people who
They
labor.
could have done that anyway. They didn't need to be in Mitzrayim to do it.
What?
But they could have done that anyway.
No, because they were the teachers. They can't be away from their students. They had to be with everybody else. But they did the same thing. They also worked. It's just that they had spiritual work instead of physical labor. The time of Mashiach is going to be the same way. It is the same way. They don't think that in the time of Mashiach it gets easier. It's like when Moshe Rabbeinu first appeared. Moshe Rabbeinu was the time of Mashiach when they came out of Egypt. When he showed up, that was like the Mashiach showing up. Suddenly Mashiach came. What happened after Moshe came? It again became worse. They had to work even harder. And Pharaoh says, they're wasting their time. They're thinking of all this nonsense. They should be working. Work harder. It's a paradox that the closer you come to the end, the harder you work. And it's true in every job that you do. And if you're supposed to, finish some project, so when does it get harder and more intense? The further along you go. It doesn't get easier.
Starting it is always problematic. That's also something.
Okay, but it's easy in the beginning. You don't have to take it so hard. The closer you get to the finish line, the harder it is. Same thing in a race. Same thing in everything. How do you know you're close to the end? Because it intensifies. It gets stronger. So this world and the times of Mashiach are not times of revelation. They're times of hard work. And the revelations come in the Garden of Eden, meaning the afterlife, and in the world of resurrection. And then you get to see what the fruits of your labor were. But until then, there's no reward. So if there's no reward, what are you doing here? I'm here to work harder. So it's very interesting. From the time the Rebbe started talking about Mashiach, it didn't get easier. People think that when the Mashiach comes, it's going to be a lot easier. We're just going to put one foot on the other, cross our legs, sit on a couch, and wait for everything to just grow miraculously around us. It's exactly the opposite. If you're at the end, it intensifies. It gets more difficult. So the explanation of this, דאיתא בגמרא, כל הנביאים כולן לא נתנבאו אלא לימות המשיח, אבל לעולם הבא עין לא ראתה אלוקים זולתך. It says, how can it be that there's such a difference between this world, this reality, and the times of Mashiach and the world to come, meaning either the world of the resurrection or the Garden of Eden? Because he says all the prophets, what they prophesied was about the time of this world and the times of Mashiach. They didn't prophesize about the world to come, either the Garden of Eden or the world of resurrection. So all the prophecies that we have are about the times of labor. They're about the times of work. And it makes sense. Why? Because what are they prophesizing about? They're prophesizing about God's will. And God's will has meaning to you, at least right now, in terms of the labor that you do in this world in the times of Mashiach. But the world to come, that only God's eye sees. It's not the prophecies. ובהמשך העניין שמאי עין לא ראתה, זה עדן שלא שלטה בו אין כל בריאה. Says, the Gemara continues, so what is this no eye is seen except for you? So we have here a play on words that Ain and Eden are related. That what has not been seen by anyone is the reward, the refinement that comes from this labor. So the reward has not been seen. And it's called Ain Lo Ra'ata, that no eye has seen this. The what? The Eden. Shema Tomar Adam HaRishon Echan Hayav Bagan V'chulu. So this is the Gemara that we mentioned just a few minutes ago. Should you say that Adam was already in the Garden of Eden? Says the Gemara, no. Gan Lechud Ve'eden Lechud. The garden is one thing, and Eden is something else. So he was in the Garden of Eden, but he was in the beginning part of the Garden of Eden. What do you do in the Garden of Eden? You work. Le'ovda ve'leshomra. To work it and to safeguard it. And that's what he did. Ve'hainu.
He stayed there very long.
Huh?
He wasn't there very long. He was there for a few hours.
Who said that a few hours there is like a few hours here? Maybe it's longer. But anyway, היינו שהחידוש והעילוי דעולם הבא דתחיית המתים, לגבי ימות המשיח, הוא שאז יהיה הגילוי דבחינת עדן עין לא ראתה. In the same way, the elevation, the superiority of the world of resurrection relative to the times of Mashiach will be that you will be able to see what came out of your toil in the mitzvah. So he's basically, we just explained this before, and this is where he says it. Okay, so let's end here.
Okay.
And we'll continue tomorrow.
You see Hashem's essence. You can't see Hashem's essence.
Did we say that you would see his essence?
Yeah, basically. You see the essence
Why?
of Hashem. In resurrection.
You see your essence, maybe. But it turns out that your essence is very similar. Birds of a feather. Okay.